Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the launch of When Did We See You Naked? My name is David. I'm the editor at SEM Press, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here for what I think is going to be a really challenging and important conversation about a book which dares to speak into an area of the Christian story, the edges of which we tend, I think, to smooth over. I've actually been reading the book of Judges recently and reflecting that in Judges, we have a series of stories which really can't be hidden. They're often very brutal and violent and difficult, and there's no hiding from them. But somehow we treat the gospel narratives of the crucifixion differently. We find it much harder to see what is really going on and see the violence at the heart of the cross. And that's really the starting point of the essays in this book. If we don't see what's going on, the authors and the editors are saying, then perhaps the full potential of the cross for survivors of sexual abuse is lost. That's what the editors and the authors are presenting us with in this book. It's a really rich and thought-provoking collection with contributions from people like Karen O'Donnell, Mitzi J. Smith, Rodrigo Tuma amongst its contributors, along with many more. So this evening we're going to be hearing from a few voices connected to the book. So I want to start just by introducing you to a few, to all of the contributors we're going to be hearing from this evening. And firstly, we'll be hearing from the three editors of the book. Dr. Jamie Reeves, who is a coordinator of the Centre for Encountering the Bible at Sarum College in Salisbury. Professor David Toombs, a director of the director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And finally, Dr. Rocio Figueroa of the Catholic Theological College, again joining us from New Zealand. We're also really excited to hear from one of the contributors to the book this evening, and that is the womanist New Testament scholar, Reverend Dr. Mitzi J. Smith, who is the J. Davison Phillips Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Georgia in the USA. We were due to hear from Professor Anthony Reddy as well. I'm sorry to say that he has had sudden news of a family bereavement, and therefore, understandably, he's decided to pull out of the event. And our deepest condolences, of course, go out to him and to his family. So we'll be hearing from lots of voices this evening. But before we kick off and I hand over to the editors, just a couple of housekeeping things. Firstly, to say that the book, this book is currently on offer via sempress.co.uk. You can get a full £10 off the book at the moment. You'll see just scrolling underneath the details, but go to the website and it's off with £10 off at the moment, so do check that out. Also, just to say, there will be a chance for questions later in the evening. The way we're going to run that is via the comments feature in the YouTube live stream, so please do post your questions in there. Those of you who have joined us for events in the past will be well used to how this works now. We see those questions and we'll try and use some of them in our discussions later. That said, obviously what we're talking about this evening is really a very sensitive and potentially quite painful topic for some. And so I guess we just want you to be aware that this is a public space. Please be aware as you comment of who else might be in this virtual space alongside you, reading your comments. And we'll obviously be moderating as well, but do just be aware of who else is in the room. Imagine this was a virtual space, if you wouldn't say those things. Imagine if it was a physical space, and if you wouldn't say those things in a physical space, I'd suggest don't say them here. And do look after yourselves too. As I say, the themes we're covering might well be triggering for some people, so please do pause the live stream if you need to. Go and do something else. You can always come back and watch later at any time. So all of that said, it's now time to hear from our first speaker. So it's over to our three editors of the book, Jamie Reeves, David Toombs and Rocio Figueroa, who are going to begin to outline some of the aims and approaches of the book.
Thanks very much, David, for bringing us together and for SCM's support in the publication of this book. For all the editors and the contributors, the other contributors who aren't able to be here, we want to express our thanks to you and to SCM's willingness for making this book available. So it falls on me to start us off with talking a bit about why we put the book together and how we did it, including kind of acknowledging the wide range of voices that are present in the book via the contributors, as well as the various ways in which they have approached this topic as Jesus is a victim of sexual abuse. So to talk about the why of the project, it feels important maybe to start out with the biblical text itself. So I've got a slide here so we can kind of see it together and look at it together. So texts that are so familiar to us that sometimes we just don't see aspects of it anymore unless we're looking for them. So this, the title of the When Did We See You Naked is taken from Jesus's parable in Matthew 25, where people who do or don't do to the least of these are judged accordingly. And in that, Jesus lists the hungry and the sick and the stranger and the prisoner, and also the naked. And so for some reason, we take the others quite literally in our mission and in our ethical activities. But rarely do we really hear anyone talking about the naked side of things. So want to look at Matthew 27, that's on the screen here, Matthew 27, 26 through 31, to see for ourselves. And so we'll start with verse 26. So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. And then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him away to crucify him. So for color coding, I wanted to highlight the places where we think, the text says. In red, they stripped him, so stripping of clothes. The blue are implied strippings, because we would expect that in order to flog and in order to crucify, Jesus would also have been stripped at those times as well. According to this text and the Markan text, so this is also in Mark 15, Jesus is publicly stripped naked at least twice, but possibly this 3 or 4 times, depending on how we interpret the blue texts. And so it feels important also to highlight that nakedness itself isn't the issue here. There's nothing wrong with a naked body. There's nothing wrong with nakedness in itself, in our view. But a careful reading of this text implies that Jesus was subjected to forced public naked exposure for purposes of humiliation and degradation, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times, if not more, at the hands of the Roman soldiers. And then we have this interesting, the whole cohort has been gathered, that implies around, we think, about 500 soldiers. And so taking into account what we know of contemporary examples of prisoner abuse, such as, for example, Abu Ghraib in Iraq in the early 2000s, as well as what we know about the Roman Empire and how it used various aspects of shame and bodily vulnerability and subjugation to exert abuse of power, a prisoner who has been tortured and abused, stripped naked, and mocked in front of what is hundreds of soldiers, what do we expect might have happened? So the central premise of the book is that the public stripping constitutes sexual abuse because they are attacks on sexual vulnerability for the purposes of humiliation. Enforced nakedness for the purposes of humiliation and degradation is the key here. And sexual abuse isn't always about sexual gratification of the perpetrator, but also about abusive exertion of power and control via sexualized means. So my colleague, Professor David Toombs, will talk a little bit more about that in a minute in the context of the research. But we also know that it is the shame that arises from sexual abuse in its varying forms that causes the abuse to often remain hidden in plain sight, both in the case of Jesus, as in this text implies, but also in contemporary examples and experiences of those who have endured sexual abuse themselves. Truths that are often right there in front of us, stories that have been told and lives that have been shattered, and no one, or only a few, believed them. So denial is both an accepted and expected part of this story. And the contributors from this book are from around the world. So David and Rossio both are in New Zealand. We had contributors also from Australia, myself in the UK, but originally from the US, but other contributors from the US and Ireland, South Africa, Netherlands, Indonesia, Botswana. And they have taken on this challenge, I think, of dealing with this text and with the way in which we understand sexual abuse in a theological way, with a great deal of skill and sensitivity. So the book is constructed in these 4 parts, as you see in front of you. We start with the biblical text first, because sometimes there's a response to say, well, the text doesn't say that. Actually, the scholars say, yeah, it does. So we look at the gospel text as well as text from the Hebrew Bible that shed further light on what might be going on. And we look at also 2 Corinthians that talks about the shame of the cross. Some different contributors have given that. And then you'll hear more from one of these contributors, Professor Mitzi Smith, in a few minutes. But then we offer creative reflection on the biblical text and experience via poetry, and that's Padre Kutuma. And then the third part of the book considers the ways in which cultures and contexts read Jesus' experience, and then how that text, the gospel text, then also reads culture. And so lastly, the focus then turns specifically to the personal. And so this is where we spend significant time looking at the experiences of victims and survivors, those who have borne witness to abuse, and also those who are working to reconstruct lives in light of the trauma of sexual abuse. And Rossio will tell us more about that. So this book is grounded in engaged scholarship and experience. At least 5 of the 20 contributors are public about their own experiences of sexual abuse, and all have reputations of work that prioritizes theologies, pastoral responses, and biblical interpretations that offer tools to enable liberation rather than continued stigma, silence, and despair for victims of sexual violence and sexual abuse. So it's been a pleasure on my behalf, but also I'll speak for the editors as well, to work with David and Rossio and all of the contributors who have been a part of this project that I think has made this volume so worthwhile. So I'm going to hand over to David Toombs now to talk a little bit more about the research and how it contributes to this project. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Jamie, and many thanks for this chance to say a few words at this event. I'd like to start with my very sincere thanks to all of our wonderful contributors, some of whom are present with us this evening, and it's great to have them with us. A special thanks to our contributor, Professor Mitzi Smith, who will be speaking soon. It's a real honour to have you with us, Mitzi. All of the contributors have been so good to work with. A collection like this involves a number of challenges, and we've been really appreciative of all the positive help that we've received from those we've worked with. Especially huge thanks to David Shervington and the team at SCM, who from the very start have been supportive and encouraging on the project. So I'm going to use this slot to say a few words of background in relation to chapter 1 of the book, Crucifixion and Sexual Abuse, which is an abridged version of my 1999 article in the Union Seminary Quarterly Review Journal. We weren't originally planning on including this chapter because it had already been published some time back. In the end, we decided that it would be useful to do so because we thought it would anchor the biblical side of the research, and just really grateful that SCM were open to that and let us add it. And as editors, we think it is a useful reference point for people to turn to and have as a convenience as they're exploring the other chapters in the book, which look at other aspects of the issue. My work on the topic began after a visit to El Salvador in 1997, during my PhD studies on Latin American liberation theology. And after that visit, which was the second visit I'd made to El Salvador, I'd made a previous visit in the 1980s, and I was still learning about the country and its conflict, particularly during the 1980s. I was back in a library in London when I read a report describing the sexualized execution of a female health care worker by Salvadoran soldiers in the early 1980s. And this was a public execution. It took place in a town square. It was not something that was intended to be secret, but something that was meant to be public and known about. And one of the woman's young co-workers, a young woman called Brenda Sanchez-Gallon, fearing for her own life in the aftermath, sought refuge with the Lutheran Church. And the church then helped her leave El Salvador and take sanctuary in Texas. Now, sadly, she didn't include the name for the executed woman, her co-worker. So like the woman in Judges 19, she's an unnamed woman. The healthcare worker who was executed is an unnamed woman. To use Phyllis Tribble's language for the woman in Judges 19, she suffered extravagant violence, but we don't have her name preserved. But we did have this story, and I wanted to take the story seriously and think through what its challenges might be. And two things struck me about the execution in El Salvador. Firstly, the extremity and the public nature of the violence and the overtly sexualized manner by which it was enacted. And second, that even though sexual violence of this sort was quite well known as part of the conflict in El Salvador, part of the weapons of war that the Salvadoran military and the Salvadoran right-wing government used primarily against civilians in El Salvador, and it was known to the church. There were good connections with the church, and the church was concerned for the people suffering this violence. It nonetheless received very little attention in the work of those who were reflecting theologically on injustice, oppression, and violence in Latin America. Liberation theologians had so many insights to offer, as I was discovering in my PhD process, on the suffering of the oppressed, but they were not addressing the sexual element as a significant feature in people's lived experience of violence and death. So in the months that follow, I tried to understand more about the violence and the silence. Reading torture reports from Latin America made me aware that torture was mainly used by the military and those in power for a political purpose. It served to intimidate and threaten anyone who might question or protest against authoritarian rule. I also became aware of how prevalent sexual violence was and is as a form of torture, and how widely it was used as an instrument of state terror. I was interested in how liberation theologians used contemporary social contexts of oppression to interpret biblical texts. So I started to explore for myself how insights from the study of torture might shed light on crucifixion. It was a short and fairly easy step to see how torture reports can help to recognize crucifixion more explicitly as state terror, and to understand how the Romans used crucifixions to threaten and intimidate those they conquered. As with torture in Latin America, crucifixions reminded everyone, not just the immediate victim, but the whole wider public, of the high price that would be paid by anyone who protested or resisted against their rule. It was a more adventurous step to go on from this and explore whether the sexual violence which is so prevalent in torture might also shed light on aspects of Roman crucifixion. This further step led to the recognition of the repeated stripping and naked exposure of Jesus just before and during crucifixion as an important feature in the text that Jamie just spoke about, Mark 15, 16 to 20, and especially Matthew 27, 26 to 31. Having noticed this and recognized it as significant and not just an incidental detail, the final step was to then see it as appropriate to name this mistreatment as sexual abuse. In addition to the stripping and the exposure, there's also the possibility that the mockery by the whole cohort in the Praetorium might have also involved some further sexual assault which the texts do not immediately disclose. In the words of Carlton Turner in his chapter, this is therefore a matter of what the texts reveal, but also what they might conceal in terms of sexual abuse. The chapter title and the subtitle of the book, Jesus as a Victim of Sexual Abuse, therefore refers to both what is clear in the text and should be acknowledged, we say, and also identifies a serious question about what also might be concealed and ought to be considered as a question. Working on this book has involved a welcome opportunity to explore this all further, and we're really pleased with the range of contributions that the book brings together. There are clearly some challenging questions and conversations that still need to take place with critics who doubt whether this is the right reading of the text. But we feel that the book creates a really helpful starting point for this. So we are grateful to the contributors who've given so much to think about on this and done so in what we see as a really constructive and positive way. And on this note, I'll pass over to Rocio, who will say a little bit about chapter 17, which is available for download from SCM. Thanks again for joining us for this launch. Over to you, Rocio.
Thank you, David. I'm happy to be here and share with you about our chapter. I will try to, chapter 17. I will share the screen with you. That's it. Okay. So I will try to talk about this chapter. And my first inspiration to engage a theologian with the reality of sexual abuse within the church was my own experience. When I was 15 years old, I came across Theological, a Catholic movement in Peru who had priests and lay people, but led by consecrated men from different countries. The Peruvian Luis Fernando Figari founded the community in 1971. I was abused when I was 15 years old and by the second in command, and it took me 20 years to be able to face the abuse. In 2002, Germán Doig, the second in command, died, and he had a great reputation for holiness within the community. But in 2006, I began to receive reports of sexual abuse of male members of the Sodalicio community. So I began an investigation, and I helped these victims to present accusations to the ecclesiastical court in Lima and to the Vatican in 2011. During this time, I developed a relationship of trust with the victims, and because of this, I felt the necessity to do even more and work for survivors using my theological and pastoral research. Currently, Sodalicio has recognized 66 victims of physical, psychological, spiritual, and sexual abuse. After leaving the community, I came to New Zealand in 2014, and I came across David Toombs' article of 1999 about the idea of Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse, and relating Jesus' sexual humiliation was a very important element for me. Of the article made sense to me, and I was surprised that I never thought about the humiliation of Jesus's body. It touched me deeply, and I felt that Jesus shared with me something of my suffering. It was a great consolation. And I met personally David Toombs, and we began working together. The first outcome was a research giving voices to male victims regarding the spiritual consequences of abuse. And it has had a title, Listen to Male Victims of Church Sexual Abuse. The second study was much more close in purpose to this current study, and we explored responses to a reading of Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse. Many of the participants of the first study participate in our second one. And why we did this chapter, Seeing His Innocence, I See My Innocence, exploring responses to Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse. We wanted to build on the earlier interviews with male victims and speak now to a group of female victims. We chose to speak to nuns because in 2019, the sexual abuse of nuns in the church, in the Catholic Church, attracted the global attention. And for the first time, Pope Francis recognized publicly, and we wanted to learn about their experiences. So I interviewed 5 female adult survivors of sexual abuse. 4 were former nuns, and 1 is a current nun. 2 had been abused as children, and 3 had been abused as adults within the church. The participants are from Germany, Peru, France, Argentina, and the Philippines. And we asked the participants to read the version of David Toombs' article, Crucifixion and Sexual Abuse. Or to read a short summary. And we asked them the impact of the vocation and faith on response to the sexual abuse. For all of them, their vocation and faith was significant. For example, one of them said, being a religious sister made it very difficult for me to challenge or know how to direct the rage that I felt and allow myself to be angry and allow myself those negative feelings. But then we asked, in the second question, we asked them if they view their abuse in the light of the suffering of Jesus. 4 of the participants made some previous connection to the suffering of Jesus, and 1 did not. For 2 of the participants, the connection had been helpful. For 1, it was mixed, and for 1, it was very negative. Lillian, who found the connection helpful, said, I asked the question, why me? Why has this happened to me? The answer that came to me was the picture of the crucifixion. God cries for me. God suffers for me. For me, this is a great consolation. On the third area of questioning, we covered whether Jesus being a victim of sexual abuse was a new idea to them, how persuasive they found the evidence presented, and what emotional response they had to it. 4 of them said it was new, But one participant had recently come across in a recording on the internet after it was presented in a conference. Dina said, "It is so strange that Jesus has not been considered as a victim of sexual abuse. I think that it is because we have this whole victim blaming culture and the idea that victims of sexual abuse have actually done something to provoke it. Picturing Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse makes it entirely clear that the victim is innocent." On the fourth question, we ask about the significance, if any, the understanding of Jesus as a victim had for them. One of the participants replied that it would have been very helpful in the past, but it had less relevance for her now. For one participant, it was not personally helpful and not helpful for the survivors with whom she worked. The other three participants each saw the idea as helpful for them. Franca, who found it helpful, said, "Yes, I think this thought helps. It's a comfort for me, a source of consolation." The final question was, we asked to all the participants if Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse was significant for the church. It offered us opportunity for positive change in how the church views survivors. All of them said that it was a positive idea for the church. Lucia said, "For the church, of course, because it can be a topic that usually is silenced." It was a powerful experience to hear and to work with survivors and hear the responses that they offered. And one of the most moving statements came from Maria. And we have used this for the title of the discussion paper, that if you want to read all the different responses of the nuns and ex-nuns, you can download the chapter. Maria said, "Despite saying to myself, 'You are not guilty,' one part of me, in my innermost part, maintains my guilt and leads me to accuse myself. You could have done something to avoid abuse. And then I have the experience and the knowledge that Jesus was innocent. That makes it easier to believe that I am innocent. It has been a beginning. Reading it has been like a relief. It is not just on a theological level. There is an emotional level that helps me to go into my heart. I love Jesus. I don't blame him. I don't say to him, 'You had to do something. You could have avoided it.' Seeing his innocence, I see my innocence." Now I pass to Dr. Mitzi Smith, who will respond to the book.
Thank you. I'm actually going to speak a little about my essay. Dr. Reddy was going to respond to the book. It is my privilege to be included in a volume edited by scholars who have been thinking and writing about Jesus and sexual violence for some time. And with so many diverse voices, and with two other womanist biblical scholars, Dr. Chanel Smith and Dr. Kibanilwe, I hope I pronounced her name right, and people like me who sadly experienced sexual violence and continue on a journey toward healing. I begin my essay with my own story and some of the psychological and theological unpacking I have done through counseling and personal critical reflection in a world and church and family that would rather I and other victims keep silent. I ask, is all life sacred? This is a question that came to me after writing the text. Is all life sacred? Or do we treat some lives as more sacred than others based on gender, class, race, ethnicity, age, sexuality, religious affiliation, and so on. Lives regardless are some lives regarded as less sacred than others, and therefore more vulnerable and subjected to violence, especially sexual violence. Have we shielded Jesus and the stories that have been told, written, preserved, and canonized about his life and death from abuses reserved by the privileged for the most marginalized among us? I problematize the church's silence, the African American church's silence, and I particularly examine how this silence is made sacred and is sacralized liturgically. For example, in the spiritual that many of us sing during Easter, quote, "He never said a mumbling word," unquote. I ask, where did this theology of victim silence come from? What gospel? What biblical text? What can we know? And what is probable and possible? In my womanist reading, I argue that traditions, including sacred text and authoritative interpretations and interpreters, that ameliorate the traumatic and chronic impact of sexual violence on its victims, and or promote and sacralize the silence and silencing of possible or proven victims of sexual violence, must be exposed and challenged. Further, many victims tell their truths because we know without truth-telling, healing and justice elude us. But we are met with disbelief and blame too often. In our modern context, sexual violence training teaches that when a child or adult presents or articulates that she or he has been sexually assaulted, the person confided in has an obligation to report the possible abuse to the appropriate agency so that the matter can be investigated. These essays, my essay is an investigation with some conclusions. Why do some of us respond with disbelief or hostility to the possibility that Jesus was sexually violated before and during crucifixion? Why do some take it personally as an attack on his memory or as shameful? Yet those same people revel in the humiliation of the crucifixion. Jesus's humiliation is tempered by our own fears and ideologies and our cultures. In our imagination, Jesus is white and male. In the imaginary of white America, he cannot have been sexually violated and still be a hyper-masculinized white male. That type of abuse is reserved for Black men and brown men and could constitute a, quote, niggerization, unquote, of Jesus, to use Cornel West's term. What made ancient crucifixion so humiliating and disgraceful? Examining the Gospels and the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, where silent suffering and the crucified Jesus intersect, and the historical context of ancient crucifixion, I propose that, like the lynching of Black men in America, Jesus's lynching on the cross was more likely than not accompanied by sexual violence and even castration. With my truth-telling, I hope to empower victims of sexual violence, women and men and children, to realize the shame and the silence of sexual violence is not ours to bear, but it has been hoisted upon our backs by people who fear certain truths above the freedom and the wholeness truth-telling offers its victims. I wish I had dedicated this essay to the many sexually violated women, men, and children who died shackled with shame and guilt, buried in silence. Thank you.
Mitzi, thank you so much. Your voice and the voice of other contributors in the volume have been so valuable and so important. I have been asked to chair the discussion session. If we're able maybe to pull up David and Rocio and Mitzi, maybe for all of us to be on the screen kind of to as panels maybe could be good. So we're moving to a point where we'll deal with a few questions that might have arisen that's in the comments, and a period as well of informal discussion and conversation as it relates to the book too. I hope everybody's faring well, and while we do this, we try to be as sensitive as possible, as David Shervington said earlier, with a variety of people who are present, so please, again, take care of yourselves. And so a reminder that you can post questions in the chat function or in the comment section on YouTube, and we can address some of those. But maybe Mitzi, yes, you were here as well. So if you don't mind coming up, I wonder if we can maybe start with discussing Mitzi, you talked about a little bit the kind of typical responses or some of the negative responses that people often might give to this work. So can I ask my colleagues, David, Rocio, and Mitzi, to talk a little bit more about that, if that's possible? David, might you want to start, and then other rest of us can contribute?
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks ever so much to you, Mitzi, for the really powerful and clear way of grappling with these very difficult issues. And what I heard you said certainly matched with my experience, a sense of an obligation to report. And yet when a report is made in this particular case, in relation to Jesus, being met in many cases with disbelief or hostility. Not always. Some people respond to it very, very positively, as Rocio said in her presentation, and yet in many cases, disbelief or hostility. And one of the responses, which I think is particularly hard to interpret, is the response of silence. Because often when you're speaking to somebody, you get an immediate response. But when it's put in writing, people don't perhaps respond immediately, and one has to interpret the silence. And is the silence a contemplative, thoughtful silence that they're thinking through these very challenging issues? And it's very understandable. People don't want to respond immediately. Or is the silence an expression of the disbelief and hostility that you mentioned? And I think there is an issue where some people will express disbelief and hostility quite openly, but others will express it through silence, that they'll refuse to say anything about the subject. So they won't address the arguments which are made, the texts which are pointed to, the concerns which are expressed, and the historical experiences which do shed a light, I think, on the first century experience, although they have to be used critically. I think all the contributors are well aware of that. But instead of meeting the concerns and the evidence, instead there's a silence. And as I say, it's difficult to know how to interpret that silence. Is that a silence of disbelief and hostility, or is that contemplation and thinking through, well, what are the next steps to progress the very difficult questions which come from this, and the very powerful opportunities that it does offer if we can start having that conversation?
Mitzi or Rocio, either one, do you have anything else you'd like to add? Don't want to put you on the spot, but also want to give you an opportunity.
Yeah, I also am thinking about the fact that about the silence sometimes that people as a reaction of the people, and I think it's also the fact when you don't want to face something. It's not just about seeing, because I think the text is very clear that Jesus was stripped, was sexually humiliated, but it's not just about seeing. It's about recognizing, because you can see things, but you don't recognize it because it faces you, and it implies that you have to give a response and you have to deal with that. So I think in one way, we don't want to deal with the victims of sexual abuse. We don't want to recognize them. We don't want to put them in the center. We prefer to silence the topic because it's uncomfortable, because it's painful, because it hurts. So I think it's also like a reaction, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, sometimes subconscious, of not facing and not putting the victims in the center of the discussion, and that is why I feel that there is that difficulty to recognize Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse.
Yeah, I agree with both David and Rocio. I've also got the response, why, right? Why, as if it's unnecessary, which is interesting. And there's so many ways we can respond to it, and many people respond to that in the book. But it did get me thinking, that question I raised, is Jesus' life supposed to have been more sacred than anybody else's life? Surely, for God to put his son in human flesh, God would know that one of the things that human beings do to other human beings from probably the beginning of time is to invade their bodies, right? To violate our bodies. And certainly that would have been a risk God would have taken and would most likely happen to his son like any other human being, not just at crucifixion, but during his lifetime. He would have been exposed as a poor person, right? Subjected to other people who are considered subordinate to him in society. Was his life considered more sacred than all the other human beings that God is responsible for having created in one way or another, right?
Thank you. So a question has come up in the YouTube comments. So why do we still find this so difficult to talk about and so difficult to believe people who went through it? And how did we choose the people to share the essays? I can answer the second one first, and then perhaps we can open up the other question for discussion. So as one of the editors, it was my job. So but we talked amongst ourselves, who's doing work related to this topic, or who has reputations that we think could be good to include, whose work would be good to represent related to this question. We wanted to prioritize a diversity of voices. We wanted to prioritize an international audience as well, because sexual violence is not a UK or US based thing. This is happening around the world. And the Me Too movement showed the global nature of this as well, and so it felt really important for that. So we did a bit of research and we said who would be good to ask, and then we approached folks. So depending on how we how we interpret those things. The collection of contributors that we got were, I think, the best ones we could have gotten, to be honest. I'm really proud of who came through, and really challenging pieces. We don't all agree, but it's been really lovely to see how it's come together. So the other question, though, why do we still find this difficult to talk about and so difficult to believe people who went through it? David, Rocio, or Mitzi?
Yeah, I would like to
Sure.
respond to this one, because I think it's really difficult to believe to people, because there is a blaming culture. Usually, victims are like the scapegoats of sexual abuse, in which, but in the first moment, the victims themselves feel guilty. And that's why sometimes they, being innocent, and they don't talk. And also there is a culture of society thinking the victim has something wrong to do that. But there is a second element, I think, because sexual abuse is not just about perpetrators and victims. Sexual abuse has also consequences in the communities. And also it's like an earthquake for the communities. An earthquake, if there is a sexual abuse in a family, it will really be shocking for the family. If it's an abuse of a priest or a religious person, a leader in the community, it will absolutely be an earthquake, a shock for all the community. So it's not also the trauma for the victim or the trauma for the perpetrator or the perpetrator doing it, but it's also the trauma for the community. So sometimes the reaction to a trauma is denial. So it's something that really nobody wants to face because it's traumatic. And that is why it's so important to address it, to talk about it, to discuss and to share.
Yeah,
Mitzi?
I think I really appreciate your what you said at the beginning, Jamie, that that we do not regard nakedness itself as bad, right? But I think we have a hard time even thinking that it's not bad, right? Or even the church of talking about sex at all, right? It really is a shame, especially in my as a baby boomer, the advice I grew up with, and the church said you just don't talk about it. And I also think in a patriarchal society, and ours is still a patriarchal society, the primary, not all, but the primary perpetrators are men, and patriarchal societies protect men at all costs, and sometimes the cost is the silencing and the demonizing of women and children.
David, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think for me, one of the helpful ways of thinking about these issues is to draw a distinction between the biblical, the pastoral, and the theological, because I think this work is important for all three of those. And some of the responses tend to conflate or move too quickly from one to the other. So in terms of the question, why is this a difficult issue for people? Firstly, if we focus just on the biblical, why is it that something which actually is clear in the text, but is often not recognized, even when it's pointed out, some people find it hard to see it? And I think one of the reasons for that is because typically readers come to the text with centuries of Christian art firmly in mind, where they're literally seeing something other different to this. So they're not starting with the text, they're starting with an imagination, they're starting with an image, which is not true to the text, but is there as an expression of modesty, as a way to try and re-dignify the fully undignified historical actuality of what happened. And because that image is in people's mind, reading the text that you shared with us, it's very difficult to see the problem, because we're not looking for that problem, as it were. So that's one of the key difficulties with the biblical side of it. Another perhaps issue with the biblical side of it is, in the usual understanding of the text, what's going on in the praetorium and even the nakedness of crucifixion isn't the important part. The important part is to come. It's the death and it's the resurrection. And therefore, these preparatory details, it's very easy to skip over and not see them as important in the text. So I think one of the things this collection is doing is turning attention to details in the text which haven't been given the significance that they often deserve. Finally, perhaps on the biblical, it's really important, I think, to recognize that identifying Jesus as naked is not new. It's not the original contribution of this collection to say that Jesus was naked on the cross. Many Christians that you talk to are aware of that. They've heard that, they know about it, somebody said it. It hasn't been foregrounded, it hasn't been seen as really important, but it is something that they've come across before. What's new to them is to apply the language of sexual abuse to somebody being exposed naked as part of a public execution in front of a mocking and hostile crowd. And when you apply that language, people say, oh, I've never heard that part of it before, but that does make sense. That's what a lot of people say. Now, those are all biblical issues. We've then got conversations around pastoral issues, and Rocio's touched on some of those. And a number of the chapters in the book speak really powerfully to the pastoral issues. So I'm just going to make a quick comment about the theological issues, because I think for many people, it's the theological issues which are at stake here, but are often not articulated. So they don't come into the picture of why people find this difficult at an explicit level. But I think that's what's going on. And I think at the theological level, it's what Mitzi already touched on with her insight. Isn't all life sacred? The reason people resist this in terms of Jesus is because Jesus is seen as sacred in a way that in many people's minds, people within the churches, makes the idea of sexual abuse impossible to imagine, because they connect the understanding of sexual abuse with Jesus being lessened. That if Jesus experienced sexual abuse, he can't be what I thought he was. He is in some way lessened. And that's an instinctive response I think many people have. And I see one of the key contributions of this book for the churches is it allows that conversation to happen where people perhaps recognize that instinct within themselves and then realize that's not what they actually believe, that that's something that they might feel, but they know that's wrong, that somebody who experienced sexual abuse is not lessened. And there's no reason to bring that theological reservation to thinking about Jesus in this way. So we've got biblical issues to talk about, we've got pastoral issues, we've got theological issues. It's a really complicated, but at the same time, rich conversation that can make a really positive, transformative impact within the church.
Thank you, all of you, for that response. I want to just say hello. Monica Poole has said hi as one of the contributors. So her chapter and Karen O'Donnell's chapters both come from the perspective of the communities and how the communities have responded. And so either at the foot of the cross or the followers of Jesus. And so both, again, excellent chapters that I'd recommend to folks. James asked the question in the comments, I'm interested to see a chapter in the book by Padre Gotuma. So what role do you think poets and the poetic voice have in addressing some of what you see in the story of Jesus's abuse? Gosh, that's a really great question. The reason why we asked Padraig to do a chapter was, well, We knew that he was interested in the work. We knew that creatively he had been doing some work around it. And so we wanted to invite him to be a part. But also in trying to set up as diverse a group as possible, it also felt really important to include a diverse range of approaches, if that makes sense. So, if we're starting out with kind of pretty heavy biblical studies work, we're doing some sociology, we're doing some anthropology, we're doing some just general theology work, it also felt really important to include a creative response. And so the space that poetry and art allows for us to explore and to ask questions and to think about something in just a slightly different way than what we might have done before just was a value we wanted to make sure and create space for. The dedication, we quote Lucille Clifton. Mitzi, you quote Langston Hughes, and Joshua Bennett. A few others quoted artists and poets, and so it just felt really important to make sure that we include that in the project. Rossi or David or Mitzi, anything else you'd like to say about that chapter and about poetry and art in general and exploring this?
If I could just say, Jamie, to add to that for many Catholics over the years, when talking about the stripping of Jesus and the nakedness of Jesus, it is for Stations of the Cross that they have as a reference point. So it's not that this is completely unknown. It's actually remembered for stripping of Jesus. It is remembered in the Stations of the Cross that people are familiar with. And therefore, it was particularly appreciated that Padraig offered his poems as it were, a contemporary similarity to the Stations of the Cross. And that's something about the chapter that I particularly appreciate, because that's a reference point that many people have, and he talks about this in terms of his own upbringing following the Stations of the Cross as part of his Easter observance, and that's one of the appropriate parts of his chapter in this collection.
Rosie or Mitzi, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I have actually to say that that's one of my favorite chapters, because I think, and I have said it several times, and I'm happy that it has been included in the question, because I think that the poetic voice helps us to deal with a very painful topic. We sometimes need channels to express the feelings, and the good thing about poetry is that emotions and feelings and intuitions and symbols come without too rationalization. And sometimes what we need regarding the topic of sexual abuse is some empathetic and intuitive approach with a heart and not with a reason. And I think that is why the poetic voice is so important in this topic, because also in one way it's also soft for victims of sexual abuse. More, it's a little a softer voice and empathetic way of feeling solidarity with victims of sexual abuse.
Mitzi?
Definitely. Poetry is important, but many of the hymns and the poetic hymns in the Bible are poetry and hymns, right? And so I also focus on the song, which is poetic and poetry too, of that we sing in our churches. And at the center of my reading of scripture is the Ethiopian eunuch's reading of the suffering servant's song, that poetic piece of hymnody that brings together suffering, silence, and Jesus' life. So yes, it's very important. Sometimes they get it wrong. The poets get it wrong. Sometimes they get it right.
Just to remind folks, if you do have any comments, please feel free to put them in. One other question I think that just might be worth exploring is that, I mean, we've touched on it a little bit, but there might be some more specific things that are worth mentioning. The implications that this might have for the church, or kind of where do we go from here in our local congregations, that might be worth, we spent some time on that, but not specifically in the book, so it could be worth just highlighting what might be some possible things we should be thinking about. David or Rocio, would either one of you like to start with that at all?
Very
David?
happy to.
Go for it.
So I think it's useful to make a distinction between pastoral implications for survivors and how survivors might respond to this and react to this, but not to limit the conversation to being only about survivors. That there's a danger that this topic and the book might be framed as, well, that there's a book which would be of interest to survivors and perhaps people who work with survivors, but it's not really a book for the wider church. It's not a book of general theology. It's on a particular subject. And I think it's really important, and this is partly based on the interviews that Rocio and I did, because we had this message from every single one of the participants in both sets of interviews that we did, both the male group and the female group of survivors, that their message to us was that this is important for the wider church. This is not just for survivors. This is for the whole church to think about its understanding of itself. And for me, theologically, one of the things to explore there is the church as the body of Christ. So how does the whole church, as a collective body that self-identifies Christologically as the body of Christ, come to terms with the difficult issues around the historical body of Christ being subjected to sexual abuse, and then the body of Christ, which is the church, largely forgetting and rejecting that human experience of Jesus, and now coming to terms with it and having to think through, well, what's been going on that we haven't identified and accepted and remembered and dealt appropriately with this experience around the body of Christ. And as I said, I think that opens up potentially positive questions and conversations around how to deal better then with survivors. But it's not just about survivors that the conversation should be happening with.
Also, I think that the crisis of sexual abuse, one of the biggest problems has been the reaction of the whole church, no? The covering up, the defending more than the institution than the victims. And it shows the lack of compassion, the lack of solidarity, the lack of interest for the most vulnerable. And I think that is why it's so important, the conversation, because if we say that we are followers of Jesus, we need to put the victims at the center of our interest, of our world, of our pastoral work, of everything. And we have not done that. So it shows also I think that conversation can be like an evaluation, can be like a way of seeing, well, what are we doing? If we are coherent, if we are followers of Jesus, we have to put the victims at the center and don't forget them, or don't cover up, or don't just silence it. So I think it is, for me, is fundamental more for the whole church than for just for the victims, or for the whole church, because we have failed victims. We have failed as church. We have failed them.
Missy, is there anything you'd like to add on that at all?
Not necessarily. Yeah, I think it's so important, as has been said, for us to have these conversations, to start having the conversation And I would caution that we're careful, something we already tend to do when we think about the suffering of Jesus, that if we are able to think about it as including sexual violence, that we continue to remember not to glorify suffering. Right? So we continue to remember not to glorify suffering.
Okay, thank you very much. Miriam posts in the comments, recognizing Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse places a responsibility to respond to and destigmatize abuse onto the church, which I think both David and Rocio said to an extent. Another comment or a couple questions from Pausing Better. What are the possibilities after the identification of the issues, so the biblical, the pastoral, and the theological? And I think there's a follow-on question to that of when the church is tagged as an actor, it feels that it's the public, but isn't it a particular person or persons that has acted? I mean, it could be individuals certainly who have acted, but the institutions themselves have also been playing a role. But David or Rocio or Mitzi, if you have particular response to either of those comments, questions.
Perhaps just to add to it and amplify it, Jamie, that the church can also act by not acting. So there are those who act, and it should be positive, but it's sometimes negative. There's also an action which is inaction. And I think that's something that the churches need to look at on this. To not do anything is to do something. And that's something that might be very, very widely shared.
There's a choice that's being made when that happens. Yeah.
And also the fact that, as I was telling, the sexual abuse does not regard just the victims and the perpetrators, but the community. So if the community, if the people, the members of the community are the bystanders have to respond to the situation. And the response of the bystanders in general has been that one of silence or covering up or indifference. Well, some, not all, but many, few people have reacted with courage and bravery, but not the majority, and not the institutional church. The leaders, in many cases, it has not just been the problem of some apples that are rotten, but more a systemic problem in which not only sexual abuse have happened, but it has been covered up because it has been more important, the image of the church, of the institutional church, than the welfare and the well-being of the victims.
Yeah. Yes, and sometimes even our teaching, our preaching, our theologies contribute actively sometimes to, as you say, covering up, to being complicit, but sometimes they are as somewhat abusive, right? Sexual violence can be violence can be verbal and it can be theological. Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Jamie, if I could just add on that,
sure.
if the question then became, well, how can the church respond? What sort of thing, at least in terms of the local church, could we do? A really good starting point might be to look at Gerald West's chapter, because in that chapter, he talks through the process of developing a participatory Bible study that looks at the passages that you shared with us at the outside. There's much more in that chapter than just that, but one of the things it does is provide details of the contextual Bible study developed at the Ujima Center, and the questions associated with that Bible study can be found on the internet. It's in his chapter, and that would be one practical and very viable response at a local church level for people who want to start having these conversations, and it would be well worth looking at that chapter.
Also, Elizabeth LaRue's chapter, just talking about the ways in which faith communities have responded in the past, gives us a good picture to kind of say, okay, this is what we tend to do. This is maybe what we should be thinking about doing otherwise. Yeah. Mitzi, was there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, the way we teach and respond to, thank you, David, many of these stories. You know, for example, David mentioned the gang rape of the woman in Judges when he started out. And I've had students in the past, you know, reading that story out loud. They're very silent when the woman is raped, but they gasp when they ask for the men, right? And it says something about, you know, what we have been doing or saying or not saying, right? Or how we have been reading these stories and interpreting them. Right?
Yeah. And whose voices are told or heard and told. Yeah, absolutely. Mara in the comments asked a particular question. Do any of the essays explore differing experience at the intersection of sexual abuse and race and ethnicity? I mean, so Mitzi, your chapter specifically looks at womanist biblical studies, so from the perspective of African-American women, Chanel Smith's as well, Umapula Kinbanawe's piece, also womanist from Botswana. They're Carlton Turner's from the Afro-Caribbean perspective. So there's a few. If there's any other suggestions or comments that people might want to make related to that question, or is that covers it? Okay. Okay. And I think maybe that might bring us to a close. I'm really grateful for all of you and for the comments and questions that people have put through. It's been really helpful. Before one more came in, is this something which those training for ordination are presented with in college, or is it just left for them to sort out alone? I didn't get it in seminary. Yeah, what do you guys think?
Perhaps this is a good time to mention that obviously care needs to be taken with this idea. It's not that it should just be thrown out there, nor do I think anyone would suggest that it's the only thing to be said about crucifixion, or it needs to be unduly highlighted in crucifixion. This is part of the crucifixion story. It's not always going to be appropriate to be talking about it, and it's not the only part of the crucifixion story. So it does need to be thought through carefully as to how is the best way to introduce unspeakable violence and to speak about it in a responsible way. That said, I would have thought training and ordination colleges are precisely the sort of places that it ought to be worked through in a careful and considerate way. I was really delighted to be told that it was used at Union Seminary for a number of years as an example of a methodological approach to biblical text. So I know it has been used in some places. I hope other places, particularly now this book is available, will find opportunity to use it and to have the difficult conversation.
Rocio or Mitzi, anything from yourselves before we finish?
Yes, I actually teach seminarians. I lecture seminarians, and I present this idea, and I think it's very helpful because you can see there are young men, young girls that are forming to be ministers, and they are growing now, or they are having this formation that allows them to be much more sensitive, with much more solidarity, which an input that perhaps they didn't have before. So I think it's really positive.
Mitzi, your experience at Columbia, similar?
Yes, I actually shared a draft just before the book was published with a class I was teaching, and had the students in small groups online, and a couple students, they happened to be male students, but you know, they were ones who were like, I'm not sure about this, but later one of the students in his very private group decided, with the permission of his partner, to share his partner's story with the group of sexual abuse. Right? and he felt that his group was that close knit and intimate that he could do that, and that book prompted him to do it. That story prompted him to do it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So we're going to hand back over to David Shervington now, and we're grateful for everyone who's come along. So, David, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And as we close, just a few thank yous. What a fascinating and rich discussion. Thank you to Mitzi J. Smith and to editors David Toombs, Jamie Reeves, and Rocio Figuero, both for their contributions this evening, but also just for their hard and painstaking, and I'm sure often quite painful work in pulling this project together. Thank you so much for your work on it, and it's an important book, and I'm sure many more people will be grateful in future as well. Thanks to Nicola behind the scenes doing a lot of the technical stuff, and also thank you to you for coming. Don't forget the book is available via our website. You can get £10 off at the moment if you go there, and scmpress.co.uk. The address is there, scrolling on the bottom of your screen. Do take up the opportunity, and thank you all for watching, and good evening.